With that, I believe we are now ready to proceed with the first presentation, which will be by the IEG pertaining to the subject of risk perception. I'd like to call on Ontario Power Generation to introduce the subject. Ms. Swamy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Swanson and members of the panel. My name is Lori Swamy, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Decommissioning and Nuclear Waste Management. Today's presentation will address alternative means risk analysis. And in this particular information request, the Joint Review Panel required OPG to have analysis undertaken by independent risk assessment experts. As I stated yesterday, and I'll repeat for those that weren't with us, in order to meet this requirement, OPG hired an independent group chaired by Dr. William Lease. We provided them with the JRP direction and information necessary to respond to the IR. To maintain independence, the IEG had complete control over their work. When completed, OPG received the report and submitted it to the Joint Review Panel. Today's presentation is on the risk perceptions of the 4 alternative means for managing the storage and disposal of low and intermediate level waste. Dr. Lees, as the head for this group, will now take over this presentation.
Thank you. In this context, I would like to introduce my colleague Ann Wiles to my right. Ann is not formally a member of the IEG, but we enlisted her services in order to prepare a background study on risk perception because she is known to us to have particular expertise in this field, and we were very happy with what we got, and I intend to share this presentation with her. Is the PowerPoint? Yes, okay. I want to read the text of the charge we were given because I think it is helpful in terms of questions we might be asked to indicate exactly what we were asked to do, and then the report and the presentation gives a very specific response to what we were asked to do. In the letter from the Joint Review Panel of March 6, 2014, these are the key excerpts, and they are, in fact, quotations. The panel expects that there be a comparison of risk perception and thus risk acceptability among the 4 options. The panel suggests that the expert group focus on uncertainty. This is because the technical risk analysis of the 4 options will have a direct link with the analysis of the effects of the technical uncertainty on risk perception. That is the first statement of the charge. Second, many submissions to the Joint Review Panel presented comparative risk perceptions and risk acceptability among status quo, enhanced surface storage, and deep geologic repositories. These submissions, together with information in the published literature and the expert group's analysis and professional judgment, should be used to produce a relative risk perception / acceptability score for the 4 options. Third, the panel would encourage the expert group to comment on how risk perception among Aboriginal peoples might better be acknowledged and incorporated. Fourth, the panel expects that the analysis then go forward with further consideration of the perception of each of the 4 options as influenced by the relative degree of technical uncertainty associated with the primary uncertainty issues listed above. Fifth, the panel maintains that use of a combination of evidence provided by submissions as well as published literature is sufficient to discriminate among the options if the expert group focuses, as is suggested above, on the effects of relative uncertainty on risk perception and risk acceptability. That is our charge. For the next section of the presentation, which is largely focused around the background study and the use of it in the report, I turn the floor over to Ann Wiles.
Ann Wiles, for the record. First, I'll just describe the approach that was taken in this background study. It summarizes research on risk perception literature, which started more or less in the 1970s. It spans a number of fields, mostly social science, starting with psychology and sociology. It focuses on risk perception in general, and then proceeds to looking at risk perception of nuclear technologies and nuclear waste disposal more particularly. It includes risk perceptions among the non-expert general public. And just to some clarification of terminology, usually in this field, when the public is referred to, it means lay or non-expert. So that's a basic distinction that's often made. And Aboriginals, as was specifically requested. We also came to some conclusions on the relation of uncertainty to perceived risk from a proposed facility. From the literature review, this was hypothetical, or from other research, and on acceptability as a concept. And this is what I'll talk about today. Now, this is not exhaustive, it's representative. It's not a long study, so I want that borne in mind. It does describe findings of research on patterns in the way that judgments are made by members of the public on risks. And as such, it provides some sort of contextual understanding of comments that are made on the risks of the various proposals from interveners. And the intent is not to suggest that experts are right and members of the public are wrong, but simply to understand that judgments differ and to understand maybe why they differ. So as I said, research began in the 1970s to investigate the observed gap between experts and members of the public on risks. This early work was conducted by cognitive psychologists who were interested in lay people's intuitive use of statistics. And it was made in the assumption then that risk is essentially a matter of statistical probabilities, so that making risk judgments becomes a matter of estimating those probabilities. And early conclusions from this research were that the use of heuristics by members of the public, which are sort of shortcuts, the cognitive shortcuts to actually using formal statistical methods, led people to make systematic errors in estimating risks. However, they also observed a consistent set of qualitative factors that were associated with the sources of risks that were investigated. And subsequently exploring these found that people were not really failing to estimate accurate probabilities. In fact, when they were asked to do that, they could do so roughly accurately. But rather, they were actually interested in other contextual factors about the risks that were not captured by statistical approaches. And also, I'll talk about some of those, but first, subsequent research has proceeded roughly on a couple of different fronts. One of them is to look at the psychological dynamics by which people frame risks and make trade-offs and understand benefits and risks. And they also integrate these perceptions into their broader value systems. The second one is more of a social and political context in which the risks and the activities themselves are set in society. And that leads to discussions of political interest and democratic processes and equity. And that's where the rest of this study proceeds then. So first, to review some of the cognitive factors that were found in the early research, a very famous finding was a set of qualitative factors associated with risk sources, which have been divided into two factors, which have been called dread and unknown. And there's a summary of them here. What I want to point out here is that radiation and nuclear technologies line up very strongly with, on the high end of both dread and unknown risks. So that radiation is invisible. It's associated with delayed impacts and with risk to future generations, and it's often unknown to those who are exposed. Nuclear power is associated with all of the above, plus with other high-risk characteristics such as catastrophic potential. It's the sort of classic low probability, high consequence kind of an issue. Involuntary exposure. It's not always easily controlled, and sometimes when spectacular events happen, we observe that stopping them is not easy to do. It's associated with stigma and lack of trust in the managing institutions. So even though much of the research has left behind that style of research approach, some of those findings still remain important to keep in mind when we're looking at nuclear factors. So sort of contextual factors and the way that we process them psychologically, there are a couple of things that I'd like to discuss. One of them is risk-benefit framing, in which we look at our overall approach to a particular risk source or activity and generate a sort of a unified perspective on it. When we experience the benefits and we value them, the perception of benefit prevails in our understanding of that activity, and the risks are perceived to be lower or actually downgraded. When the risks dominate when we don't perceive any benefits, or we don't value them, then the risks prevail as the defining factor. So this framing process then can explain why a technology or a substance or an activity can get characterized as a risk with little consideration of benefits, or as a benefit with the risks downplayed. So that polarized positions can develop when different people frame activities differently, according to whether they overbalance on the risks or on the benefits. So we can end up with polarized positions. Trust has more recently been discussed as a contextual factor in risk perception. It's a complex concept that encapsulates several aspects of other contextual factors. It essentially involves a judgment to allow another person or institution to perform a task on one's own behalf. So we're delegating that task to that other person. It thus involves an assessment of the likelihood that that manager will encapsulate one's own values in the management of that risk. Trust has been seen to correlate inversely with perceived risk, so that the higher the trust, the lower the risk. That finding had led some people to think that if trust could be increased in individuals who were managing a risk, then the perceived risk would drop, but it doesn't seem to work that way. Finally, uncertainty in the risk perception literature is not much investigated, particularly as it pertains to a characteristic of the decision to be made or of the issue itself. To the extent that it's been investigated in risk perception, it tends to be interpreted as uncertainty and understanding of a risk, which may therefore be better called unfamiliarity or lack of understanding. And that refers more to a state of the knowledge of the individual rather than of the issue itself. So used in this sense, it's been found that trust in the risk manager reduces uncertainty, essentially by delegating the management of the risk, which enables the individual to rely on the competence of a trusted risk manager. Such trust in the risk manager has been found to relate not to personal qualities in the risk manager, but rather in the individual's assessment that the manager shares his or her values and priorities for managing the risk. So the next major theme in risk perception research then is that perceived risks are shaped by personal and political values. Individuals' worldviews, which would be sort of a set of broad, basic assumptions, so basic that many of us don't think about them explicitly, they shape our interpretation of information, even the selection of information for attention. Cognitions then, that is knowledge of individual facts, do not form attitudes. They're not built up by an aggregation of beliefs of facts. Rather, attitudes and values filter our attention to information and shape the development of further cognitions. These attitudes and values are stable over time, and they're not likely to change with new information, which is not to say they can't change, but they will change to the extent that values evolve and may change with experience. This means then that changing attitudes and opinions by giving people the facts or further information or education is rarely successful. In terms of attitudes and perceptions of the risks of nuclear and radiation, opposition to nuclear power has been a key element in environmental values over several decades. Opposition to nuclear technologies has a long history as a political and philosophical issue, starting with opposition to historical military applications and proceeding through concerns with accidents. In addition, there has been a concern about a lack of openness with industry and government decisions in the past, and the accumulation of waste that remain hazardous for thousands of years. Risks that are amplified then can become risk issues and become highly salient. And that is through media attention, for example, or just some congruence of issues that heighten interest and concern about an issue, and can result in strongly polarized positions. And it can evolve with an issue in a way that's disproportionate to the risk level that is assessed professionally. So then it becomes a different kind of policy issue. And stigma, of course, is one of the important outcomes of risk amplification. So we included consideration of Aboriginal risk perception because the JRP was quite interested in hearing about this specifically. There is not a lot of research on risk perception among Aboriginals. What little we were able to find, however, shows that while the types of factors that shape risk judgments are the same as those observed in the non-expert public more generally, that is, qualitative, contextual factors and values and social assumptions. The specific values and priorities that are brought to bear by many Aboriginals are more specific and distinct than those of Main Street public, which tend to be more diverse. The values that shape Aboriginal judgments tend to be a coherent set of values and priorities, which are often shared by the entire community. And they will center on the importance of the land as a spiritual entity that supports cultural identity and community viability, and that in a more material way supports traditional activities that also support and continue the existence and the viability of the community. In addition, Aboriginal risk perception in Canada is colored by a different social structure than we often find in mainstream society, which would include, for example, more inclusive and participatory decision-making practices. Knowledge is often more experiential than theoretical. It may incorporate traditional knowledge and knowledge of elders and deep respect for knowledge of elders. And of course, there may be a historical marginalization that leaves a backdrop of a lack of trust in mainstream institutions. Now, we do emphasize that these observations are based on a small amount of literature and from readings of interveners from this hearing and from previous Seaborn panel hearing. So Aboriginal groups obviously will differ in their own perceptions. In conclusion then, it's important to note that the differences between public and expert judgments of risk have been better characterized than they were to begin with. Experts, it turns out, are also prone to the same types of systematic biases in estimating risks that non-experts are. Their judgments are also influenced by their broader attitudes and values, with such things as professional, institutional affiliations, and just broader values as human beings. It's also important to note that when experts are conducting a risk assessment, they're typically addressing a relatively narrow set of precise questions that they've been given as part of a risk management or decision-making exercise. And in doing so, they are expected to respond according to the conventions of their own discipline. This intent can often reveal a greater gap than maybe there is in more casual conversation between experts and members of the public, because members of the public are not usually engaged in that sort of narrow, focused assessment of a risk in the same way. People, as I said, often will quite explicitly bring to bear a set of contextual associations that they consider may be relevant, which the risk assessor would rule out of the assessment. Second, in terms of uncertainty, it's clear that non-experts are not really interested in quantified uncertainties or themselves in quantifying uncertainties. Non-experts and members of the public tend to be more interested in possible consequences and an understanding and recognition that many important factors are not knowable. It's a categorical statement rather than a quantifiable statement. The final conclusion was a distinction between acceptability, which is a question that the JRP had asked about, and a more refined concept, we think, which is that of tolerability. Acceptability can imply more or less general consent to delegate operations of something to another party. Tolerability describes a risk that's actually managed to a level that's deemed appropriate for the benefits that are received, and with ongoing attention to a risk-benefit balance and with evolving potential to reduce risks. The value of this concept is that it keeps our attention directed to a conditional acceptance, in which there will be expectations from the community that they will scrutinize the management activities and the institutional performance of the managers. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to Dr. Lees.
Thank you, Anne. William Lees, for the record. We went on in our to follow up later elements in the charge from the Joint Review Panel to do an analysis of public interveners' perspectives on the OPG proposal. Based on a very elaborate keyword search of submissions and transcripts, using a whole range of keywords, but emphasizing the ones most important to the JRP as stated in our charge, for example, risk acceptability and risk perception. Now, it's very important upfront to acknowledge that these views are not a representative sample. They do not anywhere approach the kind of sample base that you would normally ask in a scientific study, and they could not do so. And obviously, the information base that has been sampled is unrepresentative in the sense that it reflects personal choices of individuals who choose to intervene in proceedings such as this. Nevertheless, there is an extensive record, and so you have some basis for making generalizations about that type of record, and remembering the limitations that would not allow us to represent it as a scientific study. It is obvious, probably to you, from having heard these views, that views vary across a very wide range, from support for the specific DGR proposal now under consideration, all the way across the spectrum to a refusal to entertain storing or disposing the waste anywhere on the planet. That's a very large range. So again, given the fact that the range is so wide, influences the statement that to be careful in not reviewing these particular statements as representative. There is indeed in the record expressions of support for all four of the alternative means for low and intermediate level nuclear waste management. That is very clear, doesn't really need documentation. In general, the interveners who focus on the risks inherent in the project tend to oppose either the Bruce DGR option or all four of the designated options. Risks in effect cannot be managed. And finally, those who support one of the designated options tend to focus on benefits and regard the associated risks as capable of being managed within acceptable levels. It is true that in making this sample, and I largely did this part of the work and interpreting the sample, I did focus on those opposed because it seemed to me that this is where one could find the most insight into the nature of the perception of risk. That, I think, is simply a characteristic of the submissions. And again, the limitation is, in any case, it is not a representative sample and cannot be regarded as such. But I think the type of thing that's emphasized in the report are those statements that do reflect valuable insight into the perception of risk. Specifically for those opposed to the project, risks and benefits generally are not compared in terms of arriving at net benefit or net harm. And by way of contrast, in the normal expert assessment of in a risk management context, that is precisely what you're looking for, which is namely a sufficient degree of net benefit, or as is usually stated, that benefits exceed risk by a wide margin. This is the normal expert assessment, in part because there is never zero risk, ever. And so you will always be in the presence of risk, and the risk management question is the degree to which the risk can be controlled within what is called acceptable parameters, i.e. acceptable risk, and the fact that benefits exceed risk. And for example, in pharmaceuticals, it is basically a statutory requirement that you have net benefit. So this is a very well-established practice. But in the general oppositional statements of members of the public, you do not tend not to get risk-benefit comparisons. Secondly, the risks that are specifically associated either with nuclear waste or with nuclear power in general are for the most part not compared with risks associated with other forms of power generation. There's a wide expert discourse in society which would say, well, you have to pay attention to differences such as between nuclear power generation or coal-fired generation, or indeed renewables generation, which has its own set of risks. That, again, would be part of an expert discourse. It's not generally part of a public discourse. And then you have some very simple and very important set of insights, because as you know from what your own expertise and what you have heard, that the expert assessment of risk is absolutely dependent on the ability to size up in quantitative terms probability consequences and uncertainties. In the public discourse, probability of harm is never or rarely quantified. Consequences of adverse effects are never or rarely quantified. Uncertainties are never quantified. And in fact, uncertainty is used as equivalent to unknown, which is very different from the expert discourse. In our findings here, which I think are quite significant in a way, in part because the risk perception research usually takes a different methodological tact and does not examine, it sets up experimental situations and does not really examine actual source documents the way we did. So I think there is some value added as a result of your request to our understanding of this phenomenon. But indeed, the public discourse that we have in this case, in the case of this proposal before you, does reflect many of the findings of risk perception research. For example, that perceptions are influenced by dread or unknown characteristics of risk. That risks from a facility are seen as a complex industrial risk imposed on society to some extent and not chosen. That perceived risks and an overall attitude to a project such as this are very heavily influenced in many cases by levels of trust in the project proponents and managers, and that risk judgments are influenced by broader sets of values. We emphasize here, because we were asked to do this, that this is obviously our understanding of Aboriginal perspectives, and such peoples, we recognize, prefer to speak for themselves, but we were asked to look at this. The comments in the record that we examined from Aboriginal interveners on the specific proposal in hand do again reflect strong similarities with other similar interventions that Anne has examined in her background study. And so they are indeed, they reflect this broader context. They are consistent with it, as you might expect, because the background study shows that these are well-articulated positions formulated over long periods of time, and they tend not to change. The comments in this case, interveners in this particular set of hearings, are placed in the context of an assertion of First Nations identity and First Nations rights, as well as descriptions of community responsibility, the community's responsibility and dependence on the land for their traditional activities. They are specifically indicate an ongoing interest in the discussion of this proposal. Both SON and HSM have stated a wish to be a part of the shaping of the solutions for the nuclear waste problem, and they have emphasized and emphasized repeatedly the important conditions they have placed on their participation in the decision-making process, especially their expectations for meaningful and ongoing consultations with them. It is true that what this discourse shares with the discourse of the members of the general public that we have analyzed and I have previously commented on, there is a similarity there. In both cases, this discourse, the language and terminology used, has very little in common with the technical discourse, with exceptions. There are exceptions, so this is a generalization, but in general, it is a very different type of discourse with very different types of emphases on values and traditional activities that is not found in the public discourse. It is clear from the submissions that the perceptions of risk of stated by Aboriginal interveners in this process about this project are focused on potential dangers to traditional uses of land and the activities based on those uses. For example, the concerns about the proposed facility include the risk that there could be damage to traditional harvesting activities on the lands and cultural activity practices associated with those harvesting activities, specifically damage to fishery tourism and the local economy. I now want to conclude by going back to the specific elements of the charge from the Joint Review Panel to us and the way in which we summed up our overall responses to that charge. With respect to the first of the 5 elements that I read, we find no discernible pattern in the submissions which we examined, in which preferences among the 4 management options are directly or even indirectly related to the perceptions of risks associated with storage and disposal of nuclear waste. In other words, there is no evident basis for comparison of preferences based on perceptions among the 4 management options, in the sense that, first, there is no discernible pattern in interveners' comments on uncertainties, perceptions of risks, and acceptability. And second, very simply, there is little comparison of alternatives by interveners. Obviously, I say not no comparison, but overall, little comparison. Second, we find in the record of the public discourse few statements about what constitutes acceptable risk in the storage of nuclear waste. And because of that, there is no basis on which to discriminate among the 4 options using the concept of acceptable risk. Thus, it follows from that there is no basis for deriving a score expressing perceived risk or acceptability of the 4 options. And finally, we note in this context that Aboriginal interveners stress that acceptance of a facility requires that communities can continue to participate in decisions and monitor progress of plans and operation of a facility. So in general conclusion, I want to say that I believe that although there were specific elements in the charge from the panel which we could not find a way of answering specifically with respect to discrimination among the four options, because there is actually so little, there is some, but so little of that specifically. Yet there is in the record that you directed us to examine a great deal of material that provides, certainly in our view, insight into the perceptions of risk by interveners in a project such as this. And that there is value in understanding those, and understanding finally what is our own general perspective on this, that one does not find and one could not expect to find a harmony between the normal technical discourse on risk that is required of under regulatory practice in Canada and imposed on project proponents by that regulatory, indeed by legislation and regulation, a requirement to assess risk in ways that we call the technical assessment of risk, and including where possible the quantification of probabilities, consequences, and uncertainties. Very little similarity between that type of discourse, which, as I say, is a requirement in Canada, and the public discourse of risk, which has those different characteristics that I have summarized for you in this presentation and that are elaborated more fully in our report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lees and Dr. Wiles.